my slides will definitely be available afterwards, so feel free not to take any photos of them. I'll also again refer to a couple of documents along the way which I'll get sent out as well, so again you'll be able to get them. So I'm going to sort of move slightly away and just focus on big data standards for the remaining sort of 15 minutes. And whilst it sounds like it's separate, there's lots of crossover between the groups that Tom mentions, the ones that I'm going to cover doing these. So these aren't separate activities, they're entirely linked up. And I'm going to talk about some research I did last year and how we're taking that out and making sure there is the buy-in behind it. Before I do that, I want to refer to another set of standards around big data, and these ones are in the international arena from the more IT-related set of standards. Very much foundational, slightly technically focused standards around things like vocabulary. And so with all these new areas, terminology is very important. It's not very sexy, but making sure people can understand what they're talking about, they recognise the same terms. It's actually very important to build things. And the same with reference architectures. So all these, the standards nerds in the room will recognise the stage codes, which mean it's really a really early stage. These can be 2 or 3 years away. If you're interested in getting involved in these, tell me and I'll sort of facilitate your route in. What I really want to talk about is some research that I got going last year, looking at the need for standards around big data. And at the moment it's on the stage where we're trying to bring the results of this back through. But I want to go back to the research and some of the things that came out of that, which could be quite useful for some of the conversations we'll have today. So the research itself was done by an organisation called Circle, which is a small research agency. But I like working with them because they understand us, they understand the business side of these topics and the technical side. And they spoke to 5 people from our committees to get an understanding of how that all works, and 22 people across the spectrum of big data, and also did a lot of desk research around it as well. And there are a few things that came out of this research. The research is freely available here, and I've got a couple of copies with me, and I'll send out the link afterwards. Came with something that probably sounds quite obvious, and I'll come back to later on, that the organisations that are making the most of big data, the ones that are becoming data-driven or data-enabled, to really try to put data at the core of their organisations. But it came up with a set of 3 big challenges, which I think are worth mentioning because they don't necessarily segment quite perfectly into the standards opportunities. So firstly, there are technical challenges around big data. And this isn't bleeding edge technology, it's simple organisational things. Because if you think about it in terms of big data, the organisations that are going to get most value are the ones with most access to data, either their own or other people's. And especially when you go into larger organisational environments, as any of us who know, who work in larger organisations, what happens is the IT grows organically, systems are built up, companies acquired, councils merge or whatever. And that brings its own challenges in data activities, but also getting a pool of data together. So one of the basic things is organisations will have to invest in their core technology to make this really work. The second one is around the cultural challenges. And part of this is the fact that the people who really, I think, still have the vision around what data can do aren't in significantly strategic or senior roles generally to actually make those changes. So there isn't that knowledge right at the top in terms of making investments. But also, in all organisations, there's a certain power in owning data. So if you share it and get greater value for the organisation, it's not necessarily good for particular department heads or sections, and that does delay things as well. And the final challenge was around perception. There's a genuine and real concern around using of personal data and having issues, both media backlash or going against Data Protection Act, and the forthcoming GDPR will bring that to the fore. And there's also still, I think, concerns about the term big data. This came up in the workshop I did a few weeks ago as well. And interestingly, all the areas most of the areas I deal with, so big data, cloud computing, Internet of Things, cybersecurity, there are lots of people who just hate the terms they're referred to, but all those terms have been around for years and years, and I think in all cases, there's huge shifts behind those areas, which people get too hung up on the term. So I'm quite keen to just refer to it as big data. At some point, something else may take over as the term that's used. So the report itself came out with a series of ideas for where there is a need for standards based on what the stakeholders had said. And rather than just taking those at face value, what I did was had 3 workshops last year which took those ideas and honed them. So for each of them, who's going to use this? What's it going to be called? What's it going to cover? How quickly is it needed? Who needs to be involved in developing it? And built those out into a series of potential scopes. And more recently ran another workshop to go back to these and say, are these still current? And who wants to get involved in these? So what I'm planning to do, and I'll cover what these all are in a second, but for the first 4, going to get some series of British standards going in a new committee. So Tom covered off various different types of standards. And for all of these, the British standard is probably the best approach. None of them have an organisation or a set of organisations, I think, that I want to really fund developing as PASs, and they're all probably too immature to do it as a European or international standard, but that's where I would envisage they end up. We'll do something nationally, get some traction behind it, get it used around the world, and then put it through into either European standards or international standards. So taking the 4 of these in turn. So the first one, guidance on terms and conditions for obtaining and using data. And one thing I will say is there is overlap between all these, and we recognise that, and so we want to make sure we take into account. There's been a lot of talk over the years about terms and conditions being too long, too onerous, too legalistic, and the fact that people can't really buy into it. And there is slow change happening, but very slow. But as you get more and more closer to big data projects, it becomes more of an issue, because the potential consequences of what you're doing with data can have major impacts. So actually getting that proper informed consent, so the people who are contributing to these projects know what's going to happen with the data, know what the value is for them, know of any potential negative consequences. But and one of the big drivers behind this idea is around personal data, but obviously all data sets have terms and conditions attached to them, and that's more of a concern. So it's not just taking the regulatory element, but also you take these data sets, what should you be doing them? What governance is needed around terms and conditions? Potentially having some template terms and conditions put in. I'm in 2 minds about this, because I think it's good in one way to have a template, because it gives people a starting point. But the danger is that someone just takes that template and uses it rather than thinks, how are we going to adapt this for our business? And also, if you have multiple data sets, how do you ensure that you can aggregate those and reflect the terms and conditions that you've signed up to for getting that data? One thing that sort of I think Tom went into is about how we write the standards. So there's a kind of a map. So specifications are the ones where it's written in such a way that you shall do this, you shall do that, and it means that an organisation can go out and say, we definitely do this, and potentially get third-party certification. So this one is done as a guidance document because it's not quite that ready yet, but I think further down the line, it's one of those things where people may want to be able to go out and properly say they are complying with this standard. So the second one is down as a specification, and this is about data engaged or data-driven organisations. So Tom mentioned about management systems earlier. This isn't a management system. A management system is really a framework that an organisation will follow, so around quality management or environmental management or information security, to make sure that they are putting that best practice in place. So there is proper training, they do have the right staff, they do have the right senior management involvement, and these are probably the most widely used standards in the world. And this one, I think, will share a lot of those commonalities in terms of how it will work. So organisations will need to have a big data strategy in place. They will need to have the right roles and responsibilities. They will need to have the right senior level people involvement to make sure they're data driven. They will need to have the proper business cases in place to ensure what the value is in undertaking that and what they want to get from it. And they're swinging it back round. It's a continual process. It needs to continually change, continually making sure they've got the right technology in place, and continually making sure that they're learning from it. The third one is around big data project communications. And when we originally started doing this work, it happened to be the time when the NHS England's Care.Data project was in the news. And for those of you that don't know, it was a project about using medical data. Very good reasons why you'd use that, what lots of learnings you want to take. But the perception was the way that the project had been communicated meant that it failed, and there was quite a big backlash against it. And the people who have the deep project and technical expertise on doing these projects don't necessarily have that same skill set to go out and communicate to the people whose data is being used, why it's being used, what the benefits are, what's going to happen when the data is taken away. So it's very much about what's the process you should follow in communicating, how do you engage, how do you ensure there's the right transparency around it. So the fourth one is around basically project management for big data projects. And there's a huge amount of literature and standards around project management. And so I've asked, as we've been going through this process, I've asked the question many times, does this not already exist? And what the feedback has been is there are certain things around big data projects that need more guidance. So organisations are coming to this afresh with new issues, and they don't really know where to begin. They don't understand what types of projects they should be undertaking, and also some of the potential risks from day one. So it kind of brings in some of the good practice around project management, but putting it towards a big data slant. So what the governance frameworks should be in place, what the legal things you potentially should consider, what is the specific risk management guidance you need around big data projects, how do you get the right stakeholders involved at the right time, how do you ensure there's the right roles in the projects and potentially regulatory oversight, how do you ensure it's transparent, and simple things like why are you doing it, what's the purpose of the research. There's been lots of talk about we just get some data and we just play with it and see what happens, which is depending on your viewpoint, it's not necessarily the best approach to it. But also what do you do with data at the end of the project? How do you ensure that the project has met the value and objectives it's supposed to have had? So for those four, what the intention is, we're going to get a new committee set up. There's crossover with other work as well. For each of those four ideas, there is a set of people who are interested in getting around the table and writing them. If you're interested in getting involved in those, then contact me and I'll explain to you what can be done. And there's also a document which I'll get circulated which provides a huge amount more detail about what those are and all those things about who's going to use them, etc. There's also a couple of others which probably need further development. So one of the things that came through right from the original research and the workshops was the need for something about metadata. So metadata is very important for big data projects. So making sure that it's clean, that it's up to date, that you dispose it potentially. One of the things that came out through this process and through these four workshops and various other discussions, so I presented an early version of these at the City Standards Institute that Tom mentioned earlier, was the fact that there are lots of standards around metadata. Most of it's about formatting, but some of them contain guidance. So I think we just need to look back at it and see, is this already covered elsewhere? Because my perspective on standards is, Tom's slides, we've got 37,000 of them. If something else does this already and does it well, point to that rather than building anything new. And the last one was around the ethical usage of data. And there's a real, through all the conversations we've had, there's a real ethical push behind all these things rather than just a regulatory insight. And it's something that came out through the work. There's people interested involved in doing this. There's a definite desire to have more of an ethical approach. An organisation can say, we are not just doing what is required through GDPR or our regulator. We are really taking an ethical approach and differentiating ourselves from some of the organisations that some of us may know of who don't necessarily take that approach. So that one, I think, it's going to happen. It just needs a bit more work. It needs a bit more development. Seeing as I've got a couple of minutes left, one other thing I was going to mention, which may be of interest, is in a similar process. One of the things I've been involved in a lot is blockchain, what's known as blockchain or distributed ledger technologies. Presume most of you know this. If not, it's basically the underlying technology behind Bitcoin. So a distributed database, generally without a central point of control. And I'm going to get some research coming out very soon. Lots of needs around that, lots of potential. So whether it's around getting security, privacy and governance right, whether it's about dealing with interoperability, identity, getting it right for particular sectors, so whether it's public sector or things like music sector or pharma. And some of those things I'm going to take forward, some of them will fit into the international committee. But again, I'll get a link sent out to the report, the workshop output, and that along with the things that we send out. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tim and Tom. We've got a few moments left before the first coffee break. So does anyone have any questions following on from the presentations there? I have a roving mic that I will bring to anyone who has a question or a comment. Oops. Thanks.
I'm from University of Edinburgh. If you're looking at the data pipeline, then you need to look at standards all the way through, particularly with streaming data. So the PS 182 is really a high-level conceptual framework. There's been work by the Open Geospatial Consortium and the W3C on sensor semantics. There seems to be quite a rich landscape, let's say, of potential standards around there, and I'm wondering how you see your role within that mix.
I give my view. Do you know more specifically around Wi-Fi?
Well, I think really consistent with what I was saying. Our role, as it were, is purely to be that mechanism. If there is a need for standards where there isn't something in place, where people are struggling to I suppose, understand how you, I guess, scale up such a thing, the use of data, how you go about gathering it, how, all of these things, then I think that's the time to talk to BSI and say, I've got an idea, or there's this research that exists. How do we convert that into something that looks like a method or a practice? In terms of where it already exists in standards, I'd probably have to take the fifth on that one, and I'm not quite sure, but I imagine...
So there's a couple of other things to add. So in terms of OGC, and I'm no expert on geospatial standards, but I know that lots of the OGC work ends up feeding through ourselves into ISO. In terms of W3C, so ultimately, where a lot of these organisations will take their stuff is through to the ISO and become a liaison. So all the accessibility stuff from W3C ended up that route. W3C does lots of other stuff. But equally, we do work with them. I spent a lot of time last year trying to get a partnership set up with W3C, which in the end didn't come to pass. But we do work together very closely, but also we do things that are separate. And some of the things that W3C do are much better suited to them than ourselves.
And may I just add to that from the smart city? Smart city point of view. OGC have been intricately involved in the development of the ISO standards for smart cities, albeit they're not directly developing standards. That we have experts that sit on our smart city committee at ISO, so they're directly involved in that respect.
Any other questions, observations? Martel? Sorry, I'll get fit today.
Ja, Bartel Braaks from the Netherlands, from the Official Statistics Bureau there. So I have a question both for Tim and for Tom. So two questions. So a question for Tom is, so who is really driving this standardization process in the area of smart cities and so on? Because what I see in the Netherlands, NEN is the equivalent of BSI, and they're really struggling with getting this process forward. So it's a different setup than in the traditional industry standards, where there's a clear interest from commercial companies and so on in being involved in developing standards. For cities, it's not always the case, and they're really struggling. So how do we get it started? And for Tim, my question would be, from what you said, I have the impression that you focus on commercial use of big data. So as member of a government organization, we are also interested in big data use for the public good. So we have similar issues to the ones that you described. I think it's very important, that work that you do on standardization, use of big data. So I wondered if that's also in scope of your discussion.
Okay. Well, I think in terms of how you get it started, and you know that we had that government funding up front, which I think has been really, really helpful in creating the City Standards Institute. There are a number of cities who have become involved through that route and who are using those sponsored standards. And I think had we not had that, we wouldn't be in the position we're in at the moment. So I don't know if it's particularly valuable advice to say go to the government and ask for some funding, but I think the direct result of a lot of persuasion that BSI has put into talking to our department for innovation and skills and so forth, and I think a willingness and a recognition from the UK that there is going to be value added. Maybe the city itself won't see direct return on investment. That's where PAS 184 sort of talks about things, but in terms of others, commercial interests investing in a city because economy, because the citizens are happy, all those kinds of things. So it's that net benefit that we're really working towards. And certainly having the Future Cities Catapult, for instance, understand that there is a real role for standards in this, that there is a real direct benefit towards collaborating and building up this sort of, I suppose, a repository of knowledge to then use and see what people can do with it is fantastically valuable. So we do have these catapults, which are, and effectively they're funded by Innovate UK, which is all about using our government money to promote innovation. So we have a really strong, I suppose, sponsored, funded mechanism by which we can do that. But ultimately, as I said before, the strength of it will always come back to a group such as yourself. BSI is a mechanism. Ultimately, it's about what people choose to do with that mechanism. And be it just create a standard and see what happens, or do something more with that, create a narrative around it, talk to each other about how it works, how it doesn't work. It's all building blocks on top of each other. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's certainly the model in the UK that's been pursued. I'm not going to say that we've been 100% successful, we've engaged every single city. We haven't. That's still part of what we're doing, is still working on how do we make the case to a city to say, please invest your diminishing resources in implementing a standard which is going to take your time, your money, and can we directly prove the value? Can we put a monetary value on what you will get from a standard? We can't put a direct value on it. We do have a standards benefit calculator, which can help. So do look that up. But it's incredibly difficult to put a direct value on it. But I think I think everyone would agree that there's a huge amount of value that can be garnered through working together and understanding how different people do things, where there have been pitfalls, and creating that sort of iterative process of feeding back what a standard does in practice and making sure that goes into a revision or new work and making sure it's representative.
So in terms of the other one, so I think I probably underemphasised the importance of government involvement. It was on Tom's side as one of the stakeholders. So one of the things that I failed to mention was in terms of the original report, I worked very closely with the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, where at the time that big data capability set, and also we had the Home Office, at least one or two councils involved in the discussions, and the intention is that we will continue to have that. So I mentioned that for each of the ideas, we've got a core of people we want to work with. In the recent days, I've reached out to Innovate UK, the Information Commissioner's Office, Digital Catapult, which isn't quite government but quasi-government, and we try and make sure that stakeholder group is representative, because you're 100% right. The public sector needs to be around the table as well. It can't just be a private sector thing.
It was a question for Tom, really. Just thinking about the question in the Netherlands, we've had a similar situation happen for smart cities with our Swedish colleagues, some of our African colleagues and our Russian colleagues, where it's been quite difficult. I know BSI have lobbied hard, and it's the reason that we're so far forward, but it's been difficult to actually get the initial inertia over. And so, thinking about a Netherlands colleague, what those countries have done is actually joined in the ISO committee via their national standards bodies. And I presume you have contacts with the equivalent national standards body, because we certainly have a number of experts in smart cities that are literally just supported by the national standards body, even though the standards agenda hasn't been able to be lifted through the nation. And I don't know whether that's an answer, but I've got three. I don't know whether Netherlands would come within that set, but that's certainly what other countries have done. But is that an option?
Absolutely. I don't know what the situation is specifically in the Netherlands in terms of who they've got engaged, but typically when I've worked with NEN in the past, for instance, I know they have to petition for funding to government for any kind of standards activity. So unless there's the funding there, then there isn't the committee there. So BSI has a different model. You're free to join the committee. All that we ask is your time. And in essence, because we're not for profit, we're just sort of sustaining ourselves, whether other standards bodies have much more of a, well, I wouldn't necessarily say commercial angle, but there's a lot more riding on the success and I suppose the return on investment from getting involved in standards. That said, I think I'm imagining you talked to NEN, you mentioned NEN before, so I imagine there's certainly a route there. I've not met any Dutch colleagues in the ISO committee yet, but I think that's clearly always an opportunity to do that, to build up that international collaboration.
All right, thanks. Well, we're just sort of eating into the coffee break a wee bit, but I don't want to stop the conversations, but they can obviously continue as we adjourn next door. But please just join me in thanking Tim and Tom again for their presentation. And